A normal day that took a dark turn. Julian Roberts had always prided himself on maintaining a sense of normalcy. Despite his high-profile career as a senator, he tried to keep his feet firmly planted in the everyday life of his community. He believed in being approachable, in being a man who understood the struggles and dreams of those he represented. His constituents weren't just numbers to him, they were real people, each with a unique story, each with a hope that tomorrow could be better. But even the most grounded individuals can be caught off guard by the unexpected. That day, as Julian made his way to the construction site, everything seemed so typical. The kind of day where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The meetings had gone well. His schedule had flowed seamlessly, and there were no signs that something could disrupt the rhythm of his day. However, that was the very nature of life, unpredictable, and sometimes, harshly so. The construction site where Julian had parked was one of the many areas he had advocated for during his campaign for community renewal. The project was meant to breathe new life into an aging part of the city, a place where the buildings were crumbling, and the hopes of the people had begun to decay right along with them. This center, the community center, was more than just bricks and mortar to Julian. It represented a promise, a dream that he and the people had worked so hard for. It symbolized hope for a future that was safe, inspiring, and full of opportunity. The morning had been full of handshakes, discussions about policies that could change lives, and the usual buzz of people trying to make a difference. But now, as Julian stood at the edge of the site, feeling the warm afternoon sun on his face, there was a brief moment of peace. He had hoped to escape the political grind for just a little while, to be one of the many workers making a positive change. After all, who better to build something meaningful than those who had lived through the struggles themselves? As he walked through the construction area, his boots crunching against the gravel beneath him, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The skeletal frames of the community center were rising before his eyes, a testament to the work that had been put in so far. There were still months of work left to do, but the progress was undeniable. It was real. It was happening. Julian, being a man who valued every moment with his children, had planned to take them to the site later that evening. He wanted them to see the progress firsthand. He could already picture their faces lighting up when they saw the building taking shape, their eyes wide with wonder. It was important to him that they grew up understanding that change, real change, was possible if you were willing to work for it. But in that brief moment of reflection, something was off. A slight tension in the air that Julian couldn't place. His mind raced as he turned around, heading toward his car to grab his briefcase, the one containing the official blueprints for the community center. He had left it in the back seat, and even though he didn't think he would need it for this visit, he knew the importance of keeping it with him at all times. You never knew when a decision might need to be made on the fly. As Julian reached the car and swung open the door, he was suddenly aware of a presence. It was an odd feeling, almost as if someone were watching him. He glanced around. There was nothing unusual about the scene, construction workers continuing with their tasks, a few trucks unloading materials, but there, near the corner of the parking lot, stood a police officer. The officer's posture was rigid. His eyes locked onto Julian as if he had already identified a threat. There was no reason for suspicion. Julian hadn't done anything to warrant it. He was just another man on a construction site, an elected official doing what he thought was right for his people. But the officer's gaze never wavered. It was as if he had already made up his mind about who Julian was. Julian hesitated for a moment, then decided to walk toward the officer. Perhaps the man needed directions. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Julian had experienced plenty of these before, especially during the more intense moments of his political career. He was used to being scrutinized. Used to being judged by a harsh light that often felt unjust. But nothing, not even his most cynical thoughts, could have prepared him for what came next. "Excuse me, officer," Julian said, trying to keep his voice calm and composed. "Is there something I can help you with?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered down to Julian's briefcase, the one that Julian had just pulled from the back seat. That briefcase was a key part of the vision for the community center. Inside it, there were plans, permits, and financial documents that could change the lives of many in this neighborhood. But to the officer, that briefcase may have looked like something entirely different, a prop for a crime that Julian hadn't even committed. "I need to talk to you," the officer said after a beat, his voice harsh, without a hint of courtesy. Julian's brow furrowed. "What about?" he asked, feeling a strange sense of unease creep over him. The officer seemed to study him for a moment, taking in the way Julian was dressed, a simple t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, far removed from the suit and tie he usually wore in his political capacity. Julian could see the officer's eyes narrowing, weighing something, and before he could respond, the officer snapped out his next words, "I'm going to need you to step away from your car, sir." "Is there some sort of issue?" Julian asked again, his tone a little firmer now, trying to make sense of what was happening. His heart was beginning to race. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the usual kind of interaction one had with law enforcement, even when it was tense. "Step away from the car. Now." The officer's words were sharp, and before Julian could fully comprehend the situation, another officer emerged from behind a nearby truck. Then another. The first officer barked an order, and within moments, they were surrounding him. Julian felt a flash of confusion. What was happening? Why was this happening? He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even doing anything wrong. And yet, here he was, being treated as if he were dangerous. The officers didn't say another word. They didn't need to. They had already decided who he was. To them, it didn't matter that Julian Roberts was a senator. To them, he was just another black man with a briefcase. As the officers closed in, Julian instinctively placed his hands on the car for support, trying to brace himself. His mind raced, but he knew he had to stay calm. He had been in difficult situations before, but this was something new. Something raw and real. As the officers pushed him down, his heart sank. He wanted to shout. To explain. To demand an apology. But he knew better than to escalate things. This wasn't the time. It wasn't until he was on the ground, handcuffed and face pressed against the gritty cement, that the enormity of the situation truly hit him. His thoughts flickered to his children. What would they think if they saw him now? What message would this send to them? But just as quickly as those thoughts arrived, another voice interrupted the narrative in his mind, a voice of defiance, of determination. He was not going to let this define him. Not today. Not ever. The struggle to maintain dignity. As the officers forced Julian onto the ground, the harsh scrape of the concrete against his skin stung in ways that no physical injury could. He could feel the cold, unforgiving handcuffs tighten around his wrists as his heart pounded in his chest, a rapid thrum that reverberated through his entire body. The weight of the situation slowly began to settle over him like a suffocating cloud. He had been arrested. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. Why was this happening? Why him? His body tensed, but he refused to break. Not today. Not like this. The officers, though physically stronger, were somehow more vulnerable than he was in that moment. Their rigid, mechanical movements spoke of a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness of who Julian was, of what he represented. To them, he wasn't a man with a vision, a senator fighting for his people, for justice, for change. No, to them, he was just another suspect in a lineup, an anonymous face in the crowd. But Julian knew that he was not just another man. He had worked too hard to be reduced to that. He wasn't going to allow the weight of this unfair situation to steal away his identity, his sense of purpose. As they pushed him onto the cold ground, his mind swirled with thoughts of his family. His wife, Andrea, had always been his rock, steady, calm, and full of love. His children, Aaron and Maya, were the center of his universe. He thought of their smiling faces, their excitement to see him that evening, and a surge of love and determination filled him. His children couldn't be exposed to this injustice, this misunderstanding. They had dreams, bright futures ahead of them, and Julian had worked so hard to build a better world for them. How could he let them see their father, the man they looked up to, treated in such a way? It felt like the world was conspiring to rob them of their hope, their trust in the very system that was meant to protect them. But no. Julian would not let that happen. Not on his watch. "Why are you doing this?" Julian asked, his voice strained but firm. His words were not just a plea for understanding, they were a demand for justice. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not the person you think I am." But the officers did not listen. The one in charge, his badge number and name unimportant, seemed unfazed by Julian's words. He simply gestured toward the patrol car, and with a curt motion, they dragged Julian to his feet. The world spun around him as he stumbled slightly, the cuffs digging painfully into his wrists. His breath quickened, but he forced himself to stay composed. He wasn't going to let fear take control. He had faced adversity before, but never like this. As Julian was shoved into the back of the police car, the door slammed shut with a loud thud, an ominous sound that reverberated through his entire being. The air inside the vehicle was stifling, filled with a palpable sense of confusion and uncertainty. His mind raced, thinking of the next steps, how to clear his name, how to make sense of this horrific misunderstanding, how to make sure his family would never feel the weight of this moment in the way that he did. The police officers in the front seat exchanged glances but said nothing. Their silence was more deafening than any words could have been. Julian had long been aware of the subtle, often unspoken biases that existed within law enforcement, but to experience it firsthand was a reality that he had hoped he would never have to face. This was the kind of treatment that countless black men in America had endured for generations. The kind of treatment that his father had warned him about when he was a child. And yet, Julian had never expected it to happen to him. Sure, he had experienced his share of racial profiling over the years, the occasional glance from a store clerk, the suspicion in an airport security line. But this? This was a whole new level of injustice. This was no longer just about his race, it was about who he was as a person, his character, his entire life's work, being reduced to a simple stereotype. As the police car moved through the streets, Julian looked out the window, watching the world pass by, feeling an overwhelming sense of isolation. He had built a life in which he strived to be a beacon of hope for those who felt overlooked, for those who were left in the shadows. He had fought to ensure that the community he represented would never feel abandoned. Yet, now, he felt like a stranger in his own city. He was being swept away by the same system that he had worked so hard to improve. How could this be happening? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a ringing phone. The officer in the front seat answered it, speaking in quick, clipped tones. Julian's heart skipped a beat. Who was calling? His mind immediately jumped to Andrea, his wife. Was she already wondering where he was? Had someone told her what had happened? The thought of her sitting at home, clueless, worrying about him, made his stomach twist. He hated the idea of her being left in the dark, of her having to carry the weight of this situation alone. The car eventually arrived at the precinct, and Julian was led into a small holding area. The air inside was thick with tension, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow over the stark, gray walls. It felt cold, sterile, and impersonal. The kind of place where humanity seemed to disappear, where individuals were reduced to nothing more than cases and files. Julian was placed in a cramped, empty cell. The door clanged shut behind him with a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the silence. He was left alone to stew in his thoughts, the weight of the injustice he had just endured pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. How could this be happening? Was this really what America had become? Was this the reality for men like him, despite all he had worked for? Minutes turned into hours, and still, no one came to speak with him. The waiting was agonizing, a cruel form of punishment in itself. Julian's mind raced in circles, each thought more frantic than the last. He wanted answers. He wanted someone to tell him why he was here, why he had been arrested, why he had been treated like a criminal when all he had done was show up to a job site in his hometown. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. Not in the country he had served, not in the life he had built. But then, just as the hopelessness began to creep in, something inside Julian stirred. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He refused to let it be. The system had tried to break him, to reduce him to nothing more than an assumption. But he would not allow it. He had spent too long fighting for what was right, too long standing up for those who had no voice, to let this moment define him. His thoughts began to clear as a resolve settled in. He wouldn't let this moment, this humiliating, unjust moment, destroy everything he had worked for. He wouldn't let the world see him as just another victim of a broken system. He would fight. He would push back. He would demand answers, not just for himself, but for every man, woman, and child who had ever been judged unfairly because of their skin color. As the door to his cell finally opened, Julian straightened up, his chest rising with a newfound determination. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The unseen impact. The time Julian spent in that small holding cell felt like an eternity. Each tick of the clock seemed to drag on longer than the last, each passing second a reminder of the uncertainty that loomed over him. His thoughts were a whirlwind of questions and emotions, each one fighting for attention. Why had this happened to him? What had he done to deserve such treatment? And more than anything, how could he turn this moment of sheer injustice into something meaningful, something that could spark real change? But as he sat in the dimly lit cell, his mind turned to his family. His children, Aaron and Maya, were far too young to understand what was happening. They had no idea why their father hadn't come home yet. He could imagine them waiting for him, their little faces pressed against the window, eagerly hoping to see him pull into the driveway. The idea of them seeing their father in this situation, handcuffed, arrested, humiliated, filled him with an overwhelming sense of guilt. How could he explain this to them? How could he look them in the eye and tell them that their father, a man who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place, had been wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit? How could he face them, knowing that they would learn that their country, the country he had served, had failed him in the most profound way? The thought of his children experiencing the same kind of racial profiling, the same kind of injustice, broke something deep inside him. He had worked so hard to shield them from these realities, to make sure they had every opportunity to succeed, to feel safe and valued. But today, in front of the whole world, he was being reminded of the ugly truth. That no matter how much he tried to protect them, the world was still a dangerous place for people who looked like him. The thought was enough to bring tears to his eyes, but Julian quickly blinked them away. He couldn't afford to break down now. Not when there was still so much at stake. He would not allow this system to defeat him, to make him feel like less of a man, less of a father, less of a fighter for justice. He had come too far to allow a moment of defeat to define him. As the hours wore on, Julian heard the murmur of voices in the hallway, footsteps echoing against the concrete floors. The clanging of metal doors opening and closing, the sound of paperwork being shuffled, all of it blended into the background noise that had become his new reality. He had no idea how much time had passed, how many hours he had spent in that small, lonely room. But eventually, the door to his cell creaked open. A detective stepped inside, her posture calm but serious. She was a woman in her late 30s, with short brown hair and an air of quiet authority about her. She didn't look at him with suspicion or judgment, as the officers had earlier. There was something almost apologetic in her gaze, though Julian wasn't sure if it was genuine or just a byproduct of the situation. "Mr. Roberts," the detective said, her voice steady but soft. "I'm Detective Mallory. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Julian's eyes narrowed. A misunderstanding? Was that all this was? A mistake? The words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what he had just endured. A misunderstanding didn't explain the humiliation, the fear, the feeling of powerlessness that had washed over him like a tidal wave. "I'm sure you can understand how I feel right now, Detective," Julian replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But I'd appreciate it if we could skip the formalities and get to the part where I'm cleared of these charges. I've been through enough already." Detective Mallory nodded, her expression sympathetic but professional. "I understand, Mr. Roberts. This situation has escalated much further than it should have. It was never our intention to cause you distress." She paused, glancing down at the file she was holding. "It appears the officer who arrested you didn't fully verify your identity. He saw you with a briefcase and assumed the worst. We're investigating the matter, and I assure you that we will take appropriate action." Julian didn't know whether to feel relieved or enraged. A briefcase? Was that really all it took to be treated like a criminal in this country? A briefcase and the color of his skin? He felt a fire building inside him, but he knew better than to let it explode in that moment. He had to stay focused. He had to make sure that this didn't happen to someone else. "I've dedicated my life to serving my community," Julian said, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "And this is how I'm treated? Is this what we've come to? People like me can't even walk down the street without being assumed guilty? That's not just a mistake. That's a pattern. A problem." Detective Mallory looked down at her shoes for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the accusation. "I understand your frustration, and I can assure you that we're working on this. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." But Julian wasn't finished. "It can't just be about not making this mistake again. It's bigger than that. This isn't just about one officer's failure, it's about the system, the culture that lets this kind of thing happen every day. How many black men have been pulled over, arrested, or worse, simply because someone decided to judge them based on the way they look? It's a pattern that runs deep, and it has to change." Detective Mallory didn't answer immediately, but Julian could tell she was thinking it over. For the first time, he felt as though he was speaking to someone who might understand, even if she didn't have all the answers. After a long pause, she looked up and met his gaze. "I'm not sure how we can fix everything overnight, Mr. Roberts. But I can promise you that we'll take this seriously. We're looking into this incident, and we will hold those responsible accountable." Julian let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if her words offered any real comfort, but they were a start. They had to be. This was just one moment, one instance of injustice. But it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Not when there was so much more work to be done. "Thank you," Julian said, though the word felt inadequate. "But this is just the beginning. I'm going to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. I can't let this go. Not now, not ever." The detective nodded, as though understanding the weight of his words. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her, leaving Julian alone with his thoughts once again. But now, for the first time in hours, there was a glimmer of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to keep pushing forward. He couldn't let this moment define him. He had a family to protect, a community to fight for, and a message to send. This wasn't just about one man's struggle for justice, it was about all the people who had suffered, all the families who had been torn apart by the weight of systemic injustice. Julian knew he had a responsibility to them, to speak up, to fight, and to ensure that things would be different for the next generation. The fight had only just begun. The unexpected turn of events. The hours felt like days in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. Julian's mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. He had spent years working to break down the barriers that divided his community, to build a future where every person, regardless of race, background, or station, could thrive. Yet, here he was, in a cold holding cell, being reduced to just another statistic, another black man wrongly accused because of prejudice, assumptions, and systemic failures. The world outside seemed to continue without him. He wondered what his family was doing right now. Were Andrea and the kids worrying about him? Were they searching for answers, trying to piece together the puzzle of his disappearance? Julian's heart ached with guilt at the thought of his children being left in the dark. They were too young to understand the nuances of what had happened, too young to grasp the cruel reality of the racial profiling that had led to his arrest. The silence in the room was suffocating. He had no idea how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. The door to his cell creaked open, and for a moment, Julian thought it was another officer coming to interrogate him or deliver some new twist to this absurd situation. But instead, a woman walked into the room. Her steps were steady, and there was something different about her. She didn't have the cold, clinical demeanor of the officers who had arrested him. Her presence felt almost human. She was taller than he had expected, with sharp features and a purposeful walk. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and there was something in them that felt like understanding, as though she had already seen beyond the surface of this situation. She carried herself with quiet authority, not the domineering kind, but a kind that came from experience, from having lived through battles of her own. "Mr. Roberts," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Mallory. I'm here to talk to you about what happened today." Julian looked up at her, his pulse quickening. He couldn't quite place her tone, there was something different about her. Something that made him feel that, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, someone was actually trying to understand. "Talk to me about what happened." Julian echoed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I've been sitting in this cell for hours, detective, and I have no idea why I'm even here." "You want to explain what went wrong?" His frustration had built to the point where he couldn't hold it in any longer. "Or better yet, explain to me why I was treated like a criminal. What did I do that made me a suspect?" Detective Mallory didn't flinch. Instead, she took a seat across from him, pulling a chair out from the table. She placed a file in front of her and looked at him with a measured expression. "I'm not here to make excuses, Mr. Roberts," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But I am here to make sure you get the answers you deserve. It appears the officer who arrested you didn't take the time to verify your identity. He saw you with a briefcase, and it triggered something in his mind. I don't need to tell you what that something was." Julian's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of her words. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. This was a failure of the entire system. The moment that officer looked at him, Julian had already been judged. Not as a senator, not as a father, not as a person, but simply as a threat based on his skin color. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. "That's the problem," Julian said, his voice cold now, but with an undercurrent of pain that he couldn't hide. "It wasn't just one officer. It was the system. The way people like me are viewed the moment we step outside our homes. They don't see me as a man. They don't see me as someone who's worked his whole life to make a difference. They see a black man with a briefcase, and that's all they need to make an assumption." Detective Mallory nodded slowly, her gaze softening slightly. "I hear you," she said quietly. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you that things will be fixed overnight. But I can promise you this, I will make sure this gets investigated properly. I'm going to take your case seriously, Mr. Roberts, and I will ensure that any wrongdoing is addressed." Julian sat back, processing her words. He wasn't sure if he believed her completely yet, but he had to try. For the sake of everything he stood for, he had to believe that there was still some hope left in the system. That it wasn't all beyond repair. If he didn't believe in that, then what was the point of all his work? What was the point of trying to make the world better if it was too broken to begin with? "I appreciate your words, Detective Mallory," Julian said after a long silence. "But words are cheap. I've heard them all before. I need actions. I need to see real change. I need to know that the people in power are going to take responsibility for what happened, and that no one else has to go through what I just did." Mallory seemed to understand. She folded her hands in front of her and exhaled, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. "We'll investigate what happened. We're already reviewing the body cam footage, and we're speaking to the officers involved. This isn't going to be swept under the rug, Mr. Roberts. I can promise you that." Julian nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of hope stir within him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that could turn this moment of shame and hurt into an opportunity for change. If they could make an example of what had gone wrong here, if they could use this incident to shed light on the broader issues at play, maybe, just maybe, they could begin to dismantle the system that allowed this kind of injustice to thrive unchecked. The detective stood up, gathering her things. Before she left, she paused and looked at Julian one last time. "You've been through a lot today," she said quietly, her voice almost sympathetic now. "I know this doesn't fix things, but I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. We'll get to the bottom of it. And if you need anything, if you have questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out." Julian stood up, his body aching from the hours of sitting in one place, his mind weary from the emotional toll the day had taken. But as he met Detective Mallory's gaze one final time, he felt a strange sense of determination settling in his chest. Maybe the road ahead would be long, maybe the fight would be hard, but he would not back down. Not now. Not ever. "Thank you," Julian said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll be watching, Detective. I'll be watching to see if you keep your word." She nodded, a small, understanding smile pulling at the corner of her lips. "I will, Mr. Roberts. You have my word." As she left the room, Julian sat back down, his mind no longer clouded with confusion or fear. There was still much to be done, but this wasn't the end of his story. No, this was just the beginning. He had a purpose, a mission, and now more than ever, he was determined to see it through. He had been knocked down, but he wasn't out. Not by a long shot. The long road ahead. The days after Julian's arrest felt like they stretched out endlessly, each one dragging him deeper into the storm of emotions and uncertainty. As he sat in the quiet solitude of his office, staring out at the city that had both welcomed him and betrayed him in the same breath, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. He had always fought for change, for a better world, but this incident had brought him face to face with the stark reality that the system was far more broken than he had ever realized. He had always believed that progress was possible, that the work he was doing in the Senate, the community programs he supported, the policies he helped craft, all of it was making a difference. But now, after being so publicly humiliated, after enduring an arrest based on nothing but prejudice, Julian wasn't sure anymore. He had known that the system wasn't perfect, that it had its flaws, but this? This was something else. It was a stark reminder that even those who fought for justice weren't immune to the biases that shaped the world around them. Andrea, his wife, had been the one to hold him together during the first few days after the arrest. She had been his rock, as always, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes when they spoke about the incident. He saw the way her shoulders slumped when they discussed the possibility of his reputation being tarnished, of how the press would spin the story. She had seen him rise to prominence, watched him fight for the betterment of their community, and now, she had to watch as the world painted him as a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. "I don't know what's going to happen, Andrea," Julian had confessed to her one night, as they sat together in their living room, the silence thick between them. I can't keep fighting for this system that keeps trying to tear me down. What if all of it was for nothing? Andrea reached over, taking his hand in hers. You're not alone in this, Julian, she said softly. We're in this together. You've always said that change doesn't come overnight. It's the small steps, the persistent fights. This is just another battle. You've overcome worse. You will again. Her words were a balm to his soul, but they didn't erase the doubts. Julian knew that the road ahead would be long. There were legal hurdles to navigate, media backlash to handle, and the constant scrutiny of his every move. He knew that this moment would be used against him, not just by his political opponents but by anyone who wanted to see him fail. And yet, despite all of this, something inside him refused to let go of the fight. The first thing Julian did the morning after Detective Mallory's visit was meet with his legal team. He knew that the process ahead of him would be tedious, that the legal system would be slow to respond, but it had to be done. The arrest record needed to be expunged, and the officers involved needed to be held accountable. But as the hours passed, Julian realized that his fight couldn't be confined to just clearing his name. He needed to take this opportunity to speak out, to push for systemic change. That afternoon, as he sat at his desk in his office, Julian drafted a public statement. He had been careful with his words, choosing each sentence with purpose, knowing that his words would be scrutinized by every corner of the media. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something much larger. It was about the countless individuals who had been unjustly accused, the people who were still fighting to have their voices heard, the families torn apart by a system that too often failed them. The statement he wrote was direct and unapologetic. He spoke about the systemic issues of racial profiling, about the ways in which the country's institutions had failed its citizens, particularly those who looked like him. He described the humiliation of being wrongfully arrested in front of his children, the fear of being treated as a criminal because of the color of his skin, and the deep anger he felt toward a society that allowed this to happen with such regularity. But, most importantly, Julian framed his statement not as a plea for sympathy, but as a call to action. We cannot remain silent when we witness injustice, he wrote. We cannot allow the biases of a few individuals to define the lives of many. I have spent my career fighting for change, and I will continue to fight, not just for my own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who has ever been treated as less than human. This is not just about one man's experience. It is about a system that must evolve. We must hold ourselves accountable, and we must push for a future where these kinds of injustices no longer have a place. As he read over his words, Julian felt a shift within him. This was more than just a response to his arrest. This was his chance to reignite the fight for change in a way that he had never before considered. He had spent his career in politics, navigating the complexities of policy and public opinion. But now, he had a new role. He was no longer just a senator, he was a voice for the voiceless, someone who could bring attention to the issues that needed the most focus. The statement was released to the press, and the reaction was immediate. It spread like wildfire through social media, picked up by news outlets, and shared among communities that had long been fighting for justice. Support poured in from both his colleagues and his constituents, as well as from activists, organizations, and ordinary citizens who had experienced the same kind of discrimination that Julian had. But with the support came the inevitable backlash. Some called him a troublemaker, others questioned his motives, and still more dismissed his statements as nothing more than a publicity stunt. But Julian was prepared for the resistance. It wasn't the first time he had faced opposition, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the midst of all the chaos, Julian received a call from the local community leaders he had worked with for years. They had heard about his statement and wanted to meet with him. There was a sense of urgency in their voices. They knew that this was a moment that couldn't be wasted. If Julian was going to be the catalyst for change, they wanted to stand with him. They wanted to be part of the movement. When Julian arrived at the meeting, he was greeted with a room full of passionate, determined individuals, teachers, activists, business owners, and parents, each of them driven by a common purpose: to fight for a better future. They discuss strategies for holding the police accountable, ways to pressure lawmakers to enact real reform, and how to ensure that the voices of those most affected by these systemic issues were heard. The meeting was a turning point for Julian. It became clear to him that the fight he had been called to wasn't going to be won by individual efforts alone. It was going to take a united front, a collective effort to reshape the system from the ground up. He couldn't do this alone. But with the support of his community, the backing of his family, and the fire in his belly, Julian knew they could make a difference. They had to. Over the next few weeks, Julian worked tirelessly to coordinate efforts, rally support, and meet with local and national leaders to push for real reform. The public outcry over his arrest became a catalyst for the movement. It wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about changing the way the system operated. It was about demanding better from those who were in power and holding them accountable when they failed. For the first time since the arrest, Julian felt a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just responding to a personal injustice, he was part of something much larger, a movement that could and would reshape the future. He would not rest until the system that had wronged him had been thoroughly examined and reformed, until justice no longer felt like a distant dream, but a reality that every person, regardless of their race, could trust. As he prepared for the next round of meetings, Julian couldn't help but think about his children again, Aaron and Maya. They were growing up in a world that was still full of challenges, but now, he knew they would grow up knowing their father had fought for something real. He wasn't just fighting for a policy or a seat in the Senate, he was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been overlooked or unfairly judged. And if he could leave them with anything, it would be this: that no matter how hard the road, no matter how steep the climb, they should always stand up for what's right. Because in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered.